Today we are going to be talking about how towns revived in the Middle Ages. So we're going to take a look at what life was like right at the fall of Rome, up until the point that urbanization begins to come back. So as you watch this video, you're going to be answering questions in your digital notebook. It's a great idea for you to split your screen so you can put your answers in as we go. So our lesson goal is to understand that new ways of planting change society, and we want to be able to explain the importance of guilds. Some essential questions are, how did new ways of farming change medieval society, and what new class emerges, and how does this class organize? So let's look back to what life was like after the fall of Rome. We know that things were pretty chaotic, barbarians were constantly invading, and life was unsafe. And so people organized the feudal system. In the feudal system, serfs were the lowest part of society. They were tied to the land. We know that people were not living in cities. Instead, they left the cities and moved to smaller kingdoms. Another thing that we know is that because of the barbarian invasions, because people need safety, feudal lords became very, very important. And that's because they offered protection. They offered protection to the poor people who didn't really have any other way of life to live other than farming. And so feudal lords' reach was over serfs because they could protect them from invasions. So that's what we know. That's what we've already learned. But in this lesson, we're going to see that things begin to change. And a couple changes happen. Today we're going to look at things in terms of cause and effect. So remember, history is always cause and effect. So here, our first change is that powerful lords brought peace and stability. And this happens around the year 1000. So that protection the lords offer stabilize things so that people can live more safely and life is more peaceful. Because of that, the effect is that by the year 1000, markets begin to grow. It means that people can safely leave those manors that they've been living on, go to cities, and maybe open a shop, sell their craft. And so there's more options. Another change that is going to help move society along is improvement in agriculture. So the cause is that agriculture improves, and agriculture is how you farm. The effect of this is going to be there's a food surplus. Surplus is a big word for meaning extra. Because of the food surplus, there's a population boom. The population of Europe grows exponentially. So, powerful lords bring peace and stability about the year 1000. Improvements in agriculture are going to bring big changes to Europe. So, we're going to take a look at some of those agricultural improvements first. And our first improvement is the plow and the horse. So, if you take a look at this picture here, you can see this farmer plowing with a horse and with iron blades. So before this invention, farming was done through manpower or a plow with a wooden blade that scratched the surface of hard ground. So it didn't really turn over soil. The purpose of plowing is to turn over soil to help your crops grow. Once this new plow and horse are invented, all of a sudden, these iron blades on the plow can dig deeper into the earth and turn over the soil. Prior to using horses, farmers used oxen. However, horses are faster, and you can cover more land with a horse than you could with an ox. And so people created a harness and horseshoes so that these plow horses could cover more land. So now all of a sudden you're able to turn over more soil and cover more land with this invention. So because peasants were able to cultivate more land, they created more fields for growing. As a result, they clear forests, plant new fields, and produce more food. So remember, we talked a lot in this unit about how living was a struggle, how people were hungry. All of a sudden, this big change happens, and now, instead of just struggling to have enough food, there's actually a surplus. So this is a big change. Another agricultural improvement that we talked about when we talked about the manor system is the 3-field system. And here we have a couple definitions. So we want to understand first what crop rotation was. And crop rotation is the practice of changing the use of fields over time. So your fields might be used for a spring planting or a winter plant, and you rotate those. Fallow means unplanted, so letting the soil rest. And we'll talk about why that's a benefit in a second. So that's what was. People rotated their crops. They would plant on one field and then rest it the next year and then plant on another field. So you have 2 fields there. This agricultural improvement that's going to happen is that instead of 2 fields that you're rotating between fallow and planting, people started to use a 3-field system. And if you think about it, it makes sense. We just learned that there's more fields to be planted, and so there's more options. So the change from what was is that now we have a 3-field system, and this is another vocabulary word. This is the system of planting. It's developed in the High Middle Ages, which means after the year 1000, and increased the amount of land that could be planted each year. So cause and effect. Think back. In the last slide, we talked about how there was more fields being used, and so all of a sudden, now you have more fields that you can plant. And so in this 3-field system, we have a spring planting, we have fall planting. And so you would plant different crops depending on what time of year they grew best. But then you also have a fallow field. You have a 3rd field. And that 3rd field is resting. So what's the result of resting a field? The fields build back nutrients in order to grow bountiful crops next year. So in the soil, there's something called nutrients, and plants eat up all those nutrients to grow. If you rest your field, then nutrients begin to build back, you have more fertile soil, and you can grow more bountiful crops. So this 3-field system allowed you to plant a spring, a fall or winter plant, and then also have your 3rd fallow field being unplanted, which is sort of rejuvenating. So that is a change in our 3-field system. Another change is the Cistercians. So let's take a look at who the Cistercians were. The Cistercians were people. They were monks, and they embraced poverty and simplicity. So they spent a lot of time working the land. And what they would do is they would sell agricultural products and things like wool. The Cistercians were interested in expanding farming. So because of this, they wanted to expand farming, they wanted it to grow. So what did they do? They cut down forests. They worked with peasants in order to do that. And so you have more fields. They drained marshes to build more fields. They brought land that previously couldn't be cultivated, that previously couldn't have things grow on it, and made them fields. And then the last important thing that they did is they introduced sheep to peasants. So if you know anything about sheep, you know that sheep are sheared, which means their wool is cut. Their wool is like their fur. And when you cut that wool, you can use it to create textiles. Textile is a fancy word for cloth. And so the sheep that peasants begin to cultivate, they can shear, use the wool to create cloth, and sell it. And all of a sudden, another agricultural change because of the Cistercians is that you have growth in industry and trade. Okay, so what are the results of these changes? The first is that more food fuels growth. Okay, so let's think about it. This is everything we talked about. In the first slide, we talked about new farming methods. So the cause of these new farming methods means that your supply of grain increased. Because your supply of grain increases, you have a new cause. You have an increased supply of grain. The effect is population exploded. More people are living there. Because population exploded, medieval society transformed. And so we can see how one cause leads to another effect, to another cause, to another effect. So ultimately, we have an explosion in medieval society. Okay, so our first half is done. We know that medieval society changes, and we talked about the first two changes at the beginning. Okay, so we have powerful lords changing society and new systems of farming changing society. So what's the effect of those? Well, that's what we're going to look at next. Two things. So the effect of the powerful lords and new system of farming is trade and industry increases. New towns will grow and spread. So we're going to see a shift from these manners, this feudal society, and all of a sudden, we're going to see a new class emerge who are the merchants, and we're going to see that town life begins to grow. Okay, so remember, two things we're looking at, how trade and industry increase. We're going to look at that first. So how did trade and industry increase? The first is trade revives. If you remember, we spent a lot of time in this unit talking about how people weren't trading. They weren't leaving their manors. Life was small. All of a sudden, life gets big. So what happens? Well, trade begins. Remember, we talked about that surplus, and surplus is a fancy word for extra. We have surplus food. So because people had extra food, they didn't leave it to just rot and become garbage. Instead, they were smart with that surplus. They began to trade. So they would trade things that they could grow really, really well in their area. For example, France. Grapes grew really great in France. So in France, you would grow lots of grapes, press it into wine, and then travel somewhere else and trade. And that's called a specialization. So we see specializations in regions reemerge, really, because it's not a brand new thing, it's just a forgotten thing. So regions begin to specialize in crops that grew best in particular climates and soil. So we see the French trading wine all around Europe. And if you take a look at the map, you can see all the places people began to trade. Spain, they had wonderful soil for growing olives. So olive orchards supplied olive oil. And so in Spain, people would grow olives, press it into oil, and then travel those red lines. They might go to Paris, they might go to Hamburg, they might go to Russia, London, Florence, and Italy, Constantinople, Alexandria, Tripoli. And so we see trade reviving. And when trade revives, people are going to go to other places, they're going to see new things, and they're going to want to bring it back. So all of a sudden, instead of these small lives that are happening in Europe, we're going to start to see expansion. So trade and industry increased, we have trade reviving. Another way we see this is that we start to see new things emerging here. So we see trade happening with the merchant class. So merchants trade, and they begin to become very, very wealthy. So they become very wealthy because they're taking those surpluses and they're traveling all over. And so we're going to think of this slide as industry flourishing. So in this slide, we talked about things like olive oil and grapes, things that are grown. These are things that are created by people, okay? So this is called industry. Okay, so take a look at this map again. For example, in Flanders here, there is a big wool industry. And so in Flanders, you would use that wool to create textiles and then trade all over Europe to Paris and Constantinople, all along these red lines. So trade is encouraged. These merchants are trading things like wool, and merchants become very wealthy. So we see an increase in industry here. And as we've been looking at this map, we can say that trade goes global. Trade gets big. So how did trade and industry increase? Trade goes global. So before the year 1000 CE, we see that trade networks had shrunk. Everything we've learned thus far is that no one's trading. People are just staying home. Few people are leaving their village. After the year 1000, after powerful lords bring peace and stability, we see changes. We see commerce reviving, so business is happening. Merchants bought and sold surpluses. And because they do that, they trade these goods created by industry, and we see Europe now, instead of just being isolated, connecting. You could see they're connecting here with Russia. They're connecting here with Egypt. Over here in Tripoli is Northern Africa. They're going to these great civilizations you know all about from 6th grade, India and China. Because of this, they're learning. And so this global trade is going to help Europe become more, it will help Europe become better. And then finally, we see something brand new, and that is banking. So merchants are traveling, take a look at this map, all over Europe. And they're trading their goods, which means that they're hauling a lot of stuff. But on top of that, they're using coins. And think about if you're traveling all over with these coins, the coins themselves are physically heavy. Roads were dangerous. You might have some highwaymen there ready to attack you and steal your money. Or if you're going by ship, a ship could wreck and then all of your wealth is gone. So as a result, people come up with a solution, and that's called bills of exchange. So that means they would go to a bank in one city and they would deposit their money. When they went to the next city they were traveling to, they could withdraw that money. So it's a similar idea to what we do with banking today. I can go to a bank in Avon Lake and deposit money, and then go to a bank in downtown Cleveland and withdraw. And so we see banking start to emerge and expand all across Europe. We see bankers, as a result, becoming really wealthy because now people all over are wanting to use these banks. And so you see banks setting up in urban areas and in towns. And so you start to see these towns and cities that people had fled after the fall of Rome start to become really populated. The new merchant class that emerges are living in these towns and cities. They don't need to live on farms because that's not where they're making their money. Instead, these towns and cities are becoming populated with new class, the merchants, who are using it to trade and sell, which in turn, as an effect, we start to see other industries like banking emerge. Okay, this is our second result. So we talked about the first is trade and industry increases. Now we're looking at the towns themselves, the towns these people are living in. How do they grow and spread? Well, first we see these market centers. If you remember, we talked in our first unit about how people would go to these market centers and they would trade their goods. So instead of just going on Sundays, those early markets would become permanent shops. So you see people who have a permanent store, like we call them stores today. So shoemakers, tailors, metal workers would hire people to create these goods, and then they would sell them in their shops. And so you could go any day of the week to someone's shop and buy a pair of shoes or have some clothes made. As a result, you see small towns growing, cities reviving, and then new cities begin to be built. So you have all these market centers that are really busy. On top of that, in order to encourage and promote trade, medieval cities would have fairs. Now, instead of being things like rides, like we think of a fair today, they're more there to promote trade. Merchants would bring goods that they wanted to sell, and they would come from all over. So maybe you're in Paris, people might be coming from London or from Florence or from Barcelona to trade the goods that they have, that surplus that they have. And so the bigger fairs made cities really famous. And there was also some entertainment there. You have things like jugglers, musicians, animal trainers, all there for some entertainment. And so you have this major purpose of these fairs. Yes, they're fun because you could go to listen to music and see jugglers, but the major purpose is that a medieval fair would promote trade. So not only was this trade naturally occurring, people were trying to encourage it. Another reason that towns grow is that guilds are created to protect crafts. So what does this mean? A guild is a group of workers who practice the same craft, and they join together for their economic interest. So merchants would have their own guild. Grocers have their own guild. Shoemakers have their own guild, plus many, many more. They all form these guilds. And they're pretty big. So if you look at this chart at the bottom of the left-hand part of the screen, it tells you that by 1292, Paris had 130 regulated crafts. That means guilds. And these are among the thousands of guild members. We have 366 shoemakers, 54 hat makers, 62 bakers, 24 innkeepers, and 34 blacksmiths. And that's quite a lot of people for this time. So the purposes of guilds is really for protection. It's to your benefit to join these guilds. And so let's look in the yellow box at these benefits. The first thing you would do is you would pay a fee so you could join the guild. And the guild would offer you some benefits. So after your death, your guild might pay for your funeral and support the family you left behind. The guild would provide free schooling. And so you could be trained to become a shoemaker or a blacksmith or a hat maker if you joined these guilds. The guilds also financed building programs. So all along cities, you have guild-financed building going on. In terms of your specific craft, the guilds would regulate business. And so the guilds made sure that if you were a shoemaker, you really were trained and you really knew what to do. And in turn, this controls quality. And so you know that the shoes that are being shared or sold or are made with quality products and in a quality way. The guilds would also set prices for goods. And so that means if you have two shoemakers making the same type of shoes, there's a specific price for those shoes. And so shoemakers wouldn't undercut each other and have your product being worth less. And it also controlled where and to whom a member could sell goods. And so you have some control there, and this helps to protect the craft workers. And so the guilds become a big part of society. So guilds help these towns to grow and spread by protecting crafts and helping and contributing to building. So this is a lot. We talked about all of these different things. We talked about how these powerful lords and new farming helped to create a new type of Europe. As a result of that, Industry and trade expands. As a result of this industry and trade, all of a sudden we see towns becoming big. We see towns spreading. And so, overall, what happens? And this is the last thing we're going to talk about. There's a sense of freedom in the air. And why is that? Well, let's think about it. Towns were outside control of feudal lords. Remember those serfs who are tied and peasants who are tied to this land. Their only way of living is staying on this land. Well, instead of feudal lords, towns are controlled by wealthy townsmen. And so they become seen as an opportunity for people to become wealthy. So all these things are going on, and as a result of them, if that's the cause of this sense of freedom, the effect or result is that towns become tempting to the rural poor because town life seemed way better than this manor life. And so people living on these manors begin to desert the manors. In the second half of this unit, we're going to start looking at this change in medieval society that we saw in today's lesson. Ultimately, we're going to see a weakened feudal system. So keep looking for that term, weakened feudal system. There's going to be lots of events, wars, plagues that we're going to learn about. And every single thing contributes to the weakening of this feudal system. And once the feudal system dies, that becomes the end of the Middle Ages. So, we know that there's two major things happening. Okay, the first thing that we know is that trade and industry increase. Why does that happen? Trade and industry increases because of the stability from powerful lords and because of these new ways of farming. Please see your teacher if you have any questions, and be sure that you have completed your digital notebook questions. Thank you for listening.